For nearly 2 decades, weed control in American agriculture looked like a solved problem. One product, one herbicide, one program, glyphosate. When glyphosate-tolerant crops were introduced in the late 1990s, the system felt revolutionary. Farmers could plant corn or soybeans engineered to survive glyphosate, spray the field once weeds emerged, and watch nearly everything green disappear. The result was one of the simplest weed control systems modern farming had ever seen. And for a while, it worked almost perfectly. Fields stayed clean, labor costs dropped, tillage became less necessary, input programs became easier to manage. For producers dealing with razor-thin margins, the simplicity was powerful. Instead of juggling multiple herbicides with different timings and risks, one product handled nearly everything. But there was a biological detail quietly unfolding in every treated field across the country. Evolution. Weeds are not passive plants randomly growing in the field. They are highly adaptable species that produce massive numbers of seeds every season. Some species can generate hundreds of thousands of seeds from a single plant. Others can produce millions per acre. Inside those massive populations, genetic variation is always present. Most of the time, those variations don't matter. But occasionally, one plant carries a mutation that changes everything. Somewhere inside a field of waterhemp, palm or amaranth, or Marestail, a single plant survives an herbicide application that should have killed it. Maybe its metabolism breaks down the chemical faster. Maybe the herbicide cannot bind properly to its target site. Maybe the plant simply absorbs less of the product. Whatever the mechanism, the outcome is the same. The plant survives, and surviving plants reproduce. The first year, no one notices. The second year, it still looks like a clean field. By the third or fourth season, small patches of weeds start appearing after the spray pass. Most farmers assume something simple went wrong. Perhaps the sprayer pressure wasn't correct. Maybe the wind affected coverage. Maybe the weeds were slightly too large at application. So they spray again. Some weeds die, others remain standing. 5 years later, those surviving patches begin spreading across the field. 10 years later, entire sections of farmland are dominated by weeds that glyphosate simply cannot kill anymore. What once looked like the most efficient weed control system in agriculture had quietly started breaking down. Today, herbicide-resistant weeds are one of the fastest-growing agronomic threats in North American crop production. Researchers estimate that herbicide resistance is already costing agriculture more than $43 billion annually through yield loss, increased herbicide costs, and more complex management programs. And the problem continues expanding. Because once resistance develops in a weed population, it does not disappear. It spreads fast. Some weed species release seeds that can travel miles through wind, harvest equipment, or water movement. Others can cross-pollinate with neighboring populations, spreading resistance genes across entire regions within just a few seasons. Even worse, many weed seeds remain viable in the soil for years, forming what agronomists call a seed bank. That means even if a farmer manages to control resistant plants one season, thousands of seeds may already be waiting underground to germinate in future years. The result is a new generation of weeds that are not only difficult to control, they are built to survive the exact tools farmers have relied on for decades. And in some regions, these weeds are no longer just a nuisance. They are yield killers. Palm or amaranth, for example, can grow several inches per day under the right conditions and easily outcompete soybean plants for sunlight, water, and nutrients. Waterhemp can emerge continuously throughout the growing season, meaning a single herbicide application rarely controls the entire population. Marestail has already developed resistance to multiple herbicide modes of action in many areas. In short, the weeds adapted faster than the chemical programs designed to stop them. And here's the uncomfortable truth many farmers are only beginning to realize. This crisis did not happen overnight. It was built slowly over 20 years of repeating the exact same herbicide strategy across millions of acres. Same product, same timing, same mode of action, season after season. When that happens, the field becomes a giant evolutionary filter. Every spray eliminates the susceptible plants. And every surviving plant passes its resistance genes to the next generation. Eventually, the resistant plants are no longer rare. They become the majority. That's the moment when farmers start seeing something strange. The sprayer passes through the field. The correct rate is applied. The weather conditions are perfect. And yet the weeds remain standing. Tall, healthy, completely alive. At that point, the question is no longer which herbicide to spray. The real question becomes much bigger. How did agriculture allow this to happen? Because understanding how herbicide resistance evolves is the only way farmers can stop the next wave of superweeds before it spreads even further. And in the next part, we're going to break down the biology behind herbicide resistance. Once you understand how these weeds evolve, it becomes clear why many traditional herbicide programs are already losing the battle. To understand why herbicide resistance has become such a massive problem, you have to start with a simple biological reality. Weeds evolve faster than farming systems. Every acre of farmland is home to millions of individual weed plants. Each one carries slightly different genetic traits. Most of those differences don't matter, but a few of them can determine whether a plant lives or dies after a herbicide application. When farmers spray an herbicide, they are not just controlling weeds. They are applying selection pressure. That pressure acts like a filter. Susceptible plants die. Any plant with even a small level of tolerance survives. Those survivors produce seeds, and those seeds inherit the traits that allowed the parent plant to live. Over time, the population shifts. At first, resistant individuals are extremely rare. Maybe one plant in a million carries the mutation. No one notices. But repeated herbicide applications begin removing all the susceptible plants from the field. Each spray leaves behind the survivors. Generation after generation, the percentage of resistant weeds slowly increases. Then something interesting happens. The population crosses a tipping point. Instead of being a rare genetic accident, resistance becomes the dominant trait in the field. At that moment, the herbicide program collapses. Not because the chemical suddenly stopped working, but because the weed population changed. This process is called herbicide resistance evolution, and it follows the exact same biological principles that drive antibiotic resistance in bacteria. The more often a single mode of action is used, the faster resistant individuals are selected. And that's exactly what happened with glyphosate. For years, glyphosate was used across millions of acres with very little variation in management strategy. Farmers relied on it because it was cheap, effective, and simple. Chemical companies promoted it heavily because it worked well and supported the adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops. The result was an agricultural system built around a single tool. And biologically speaking, that created the perfect environment for resistance to evolve. But here's where things get even more complicated. Many weeds today are no longer resistant to just one herbicide. They are resistant to several. Scientists call this multiple resistance. A weed population might survive glyphosate, ALS inhibitors, and PPO herbicides all at the same time. This happens because weeds can develop resistance through several different biological mechanisms. One of the most common mechanisms is target site resistance. In this case, the weed develops a mutation that changes the protein the herbicide normally attacks. If the herbicide can't bind to its target inside the plant, the chemical becomes ineffective. Another mechanism is metabolic resistance. Instead of blocking the herbicide's target, the plant develops the ability to break down the herbicide before it can cause damage. Essentially, the weed turns the herbicide into harmless compounds. Some plants can even pump herbicides out of their cells, preventing toxic concentrations from building up. From an evolutionary perspective, these adaptations are incredibly powerful, because once a population develops metabolic resistance, it can sometimes survive herbicides it has never even encountered before. That's one reason some resistant weeds appear to spread so quickly. They are not adapting to one specific product. They are adapting to entire classes of herbicides. Now add another factor that makes the problem even harder to control. Seed production. Many of the most problematic weeds in American agriculture are extremely aggressive seed producers. Palmer amaranth, for example, can produce more than 500,000 seeds from a single plant under ideal conditions. Waterhemp can release hundreds of thousands of seeds as well. If even a few resistant plants survive in a field, they can create a massive new generation of resistant offspring in a single season. And those seeds don't stay in one place. They move through harvesting equipment. They move through wind. They move through waterways and wildlife. Within just a few years, resistant populations can spread across entire farming regions. This is why herbicide resistance is no longer considered an isolated farm problem. It's a landscape-level issue. Once resistance becomes common in a region, every farm nearby is affected. Even producers who follow careful management practices can see resistant weeds entering their fields from neighboring land. And that leads to the uncomfortable reality facing agriculture today. The old weed control system was built on simplicity. Spray one product, solve the problem. But biology doesn't respect simple systems for very long. When millions of acres repeat the same practice year after year, evolution eventually finds a way through the cracks. In the next part, we'll look at the weeds that are causing the biggest problems right now in American crop production. Because not all weeds are equal. Some species have become especially dangerous. They grow faster, they produce more seeds, and they develop resistance faster than most farmers ever expected. These are the plants agronomists are now calling superweeds. And on some farms, they are already changing the economics of crop production. Not all weeds are created equal. Some are inconvenient, others are economically devastating. Over the past 2 decades, a handful of species have emerged as the most dangerous herbicide-resistant weeds in North American crop production. These weeds share 3 critical traits: they grow fast, they produce massive numbers of seeds, and they evolve resistance faster than most control programs can adapt. Agronomists now regularly refer to them as superweeds. And if you farm corn or soybeans in the United States, chances are you've already seen at least one of them. Let's start with the most infamous. Palmer amaranth. If herbicide resistance had a poster child, Palmer amaranth would be it. Originally more common in the southern United States, Palmer amaranth has expanded northward across much of the Corn Belt over the last decade. The reason it spreads so quickly is simple. Palmer amaranth grows incredibly fast. Under warm conditions, the plant can grow 2 to 3 inches per day. Within a few weeks it can tower above soybean plants and begin stealing sunlight, water, and nutrients. But the real danger comes from its reproductive power. A single female Palmer amaranth plant can produce 500,000 seeds. 500,000. That means just a few surviving plants in a field can create an explosion of new weeds the following season. And many Palmer populations are now resistant to multiple herbicide modes of action, including glyphosate. Next comes a weed many farmers in the Midwest know all too well. Waterhemp. Waterhemp is closely related to Palmer amaranth, and it shares many of the same aggressive characteristics. It emerges later in the season than many crops, which means early herbicide applications often miss a large portion of the population. Even worse, waterhemp doesn't germinate all at once. It can continue emerging for weeks or even months during the growing season. That makes it extremely difficult to control with a single post-emergent herbicide application. Many waterhemp populations today are resistant to multiple herbicide classes, forcing farmers to rely on more complex and expensive control strategies. The third weed on the list is Marestail, also known as horseweed. Unlike Palmer and waterhemp, Marestail has a different survival strategy. Instead of producing huge plants, it spreads by producing enormous numbers of extremely light seeds that travel long distances through the wind. A single plant can release tens of thousands of seeds capable of drifting across entire fields or even neighboring farms. Marestail was actually one of the first weeds to develop glyphosate resistance in the United States. Today it's widespread across many soybean-producing regions. Next comes a weed many farmers underestimated for years. Giant ragweed. At first glance, giant ragweed doesn't seem particularly threatening. But once it escapes herbicide control, it lives up to its name. The plant can grow extremely tall and dense, competing aggressively with corn and soybean crops. Even a small number of ragweed plants per acre can significantly reduce yields. and many populations are now resistant to glyphosate and ALS-inhibiting herbicides. Finally, there's a weed that has quietly become a nightmare for no-till systems. Italian ryegrass. This species has developed resistance to several herbicides used in both row crops and small grain systems. What makes ryegrass especially problematic is its ability to evolve resistance quickly and spread through contaminated seed, machinery, and livestock movement. In some regions, farmers are already dealing with populations resistant to multiple herbicide modes of action, making chemical control extremely difficult. Individually, each of these weeds is a serious problem. Together, they represent a massive shift in how weed management must be handled. Because the old approach many farms relied on was built around a simple assumption that herbicides would always stay ahead of the weeds. But these species prove something very different. Weeds are evolving faster than the systems designed to control them, and when resistant populations become dominant in a field, the economic impact can be severe. Researchers have documented yield losses reaching 30 to 80% in heavily infested soybean fields when aggressive weeds like palmer amaranth are left uncontrolled. Even moderate infestations can dramatically reduce profitability, and controlling those infestations now requires far more complex programs than the single-product strategies farmers used 20 years ago. More herbicides, more applications, more management decisions, more cost. Which brings us to one of the biggest mistakes many farms are still making today. Trying to solve the resistance problem by simply spraying more chemistry, more product, higher rates, additional applications. Unfortunately, that strategy often accelerates the problem instead of solving it. Because if the same mode of action keeps being used, the evolutionary pressure remains exactly the same. In the next part, we'll look at the strategy agronomists now consider essential for slowing herbicide resistance. A concept many farms ignored for years, but one that can dramatically extend the life of herbicides and protect crop yields. Herbicide rotation by mode of action. It sounds simple, but when done correctly, it can be the difference between a manageable weed program and a field completely overrun by resistant plants. For years, many farmers responded to herbicide resistance the same way people respond to most problems in agriculture. They used more product, higher rates, more applications. On the surface, that reaction makes sense. If weeds survive a spray pass, the natural instinct is to spray again or increase the dose. But biologically, that approach often accelerates the problem. Because resistance is driven by selection pressure. Every time the same herbicide mode of action is used, the field becomes an evolutionary filter. Susceptible weeds die, resistant weeds survive, and every surviving plant produces seeds that carry the resistance trait into the next generation. Spraying the same herbicide again doesn't remove the resistant plants. It simply eliminates any remaining susceptible individuals, allowing the resistant population to dominate even faster. That's why agronomists now emphasize one rule above almost everything else in modern weed management: rotate herbicide modes of action. Not just products, modes of action. This distinction is critical. Many farmers believe they are rotating herbicides because they switch brands or trade names from year to year. But if those products rely on the same underlying biochemical mechanism inside the plant, the weeds experience the exact same selection pressure. From an evolutionary standpoint, nothing changes. Rotating modes of action means using herbicides that attack weeds in fundamentally different biological ways. One herbicide might inhibit a key enzyme involved in amino acid production. Another might disrupt photosynthesis. Another might prevent cell division during early plant development. Each of these mechanisms targets a different biological pathway inside the weed. When multiple modes of action are used in a well-designed program, the odds of a single weed surviving all of them become dramatically lower. But modern resistance management goes even further than simple rotation. Agronomists increasingly recommend herbicide stacking. This means applying multiple effective modes of action within the same season, often within the same application program. The goal is simple: make it extremely difficult for any weed to survive. If one herbicide fails to kill the plant, the second or third mode of action finishes the job. From a resistance perspective, this approach reduces the chances that a single mutation will allow survival. However, herbicides alone are no longer enough. This is one of the biggest shifts happening in weed science today. For decades, weed control strategies focused almost entirely on chemical solutions. But many agronomists now emphasize something called integrated weed management. Integrated weed management, often shortened to IWM, combines multiple strategies to control weeds and reduce the chances of resistance evolving. Herbicides are still part of the system, but they are no longer the only tool. Crop rotation plays an important role. Different crops allow farmers to use different herbicide programs and different planting schedules, disrupting weed life cycles. Planting dates can also influence weed pressure. Changing the timing of crop establishment can reduce the advantage certain weed species have during early growth stages. Mechanical control methods like cultivation may return in some systems, particularly where resistance has become severe. And increasingly, farmers are exploring cover crops as a biological weed suppression tool. Certain cover crop species can create dense canopy coverage that reduces sunlight reaching the soil surface. Without sufficient light, many weed seeds struggle to germinate or compete with the crop. This doesn't eliminate weeds entirely, but it can significantly reduce weed pressure and make herbicide programs more effective. Another critical strategy involves pre-emergent herbicides. For years, many farms relied primarily on post-emergent applications, spraying weeds after they appeared in the field. But resistant weeds often emerge quickly and aggressively. By the time they are visible, they may already be difficult to control. Pre-emergent herbicides work differently. They create a chemical barrier in the soil that prevents weed seedlings from establishing in the first place. This approach reduces the number of weeds that ever reach the post-emergent stage. When used correctly, pre-emergent programs can dramatically lower the overall weed population farmers must manage during the season. Taken together, these strategies represent a major shift in weed control philosophy. Instead of relying on a single powerful tool, modern weed management focuses on layered defenses. Multiple herbicides, multiple timings, multiple biological and agronomic strategies working together. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: the era of simple weed control is over. The fields that remain profitable in the future will not necessarily be the ones using the most chemicals. They will be the ones using the smartest systems. And that brings us to the final and most important question: what happens if farmers ignore this shift? Because in many regions, some farms are already learning the answer the hard way. In the final part, we'll examine the real economic cost of herbicide resistance over time, and why doing nothing can quietly drain thousands of dollars per acre from a farm's profitability. For many farmers, fungicide applications have become routine. Spray at R3, protect the crop, secure the yield. But the real question isn't whether fungicides can protect crops. The real question is whether they are protecting profit. In some seasons when disease pressure is high, fungicides can deliver strong returns. They preserve leaf area, protect photosynthesis, and help crops reach their full genetic potential. But in many seasons, disease pressure never reaches economic thresholds. And when that happens, a preventive fungicide pass becomes exactly what many agronomists quietly call it: an insurance policy that never pays out. Across millions of acres, those small decisions accumulate. $40 per acre here, $50 per acre there. Multiply that across an entire operation, and the numbers become significant. That doesn't mean fungicides are useless. It means they need to be used strategically. Targeted applications based on disease pressure, weather conditions, hybrid susceptibility, and scouting data will always outperform automatic calendar sprays. Because modern agriculture is no longer about applying more inputs. It's about applying the right input at the right time for the right reason. The farms that win in the next decade will not be the ones spending the most on crop protection. They will be the ones making the smartest agronomic decisions. And sometimes, the most profitable spray pass is the one you never make. If you want more data-driven breakdowns on the hidden profit killers in modern agriculture, subscribe to Farm Tech Insights.